Wars of the Roses, known back then as the Cousins' War, was a bitter fight for the English throne in the 15th century. Rival noble houses, each convinced of its right to rule, turned the kingdom into a battleground. Caught in this chaos was one extraordinary woman who would shake the status quo. She was a commoner with bold ambition, determined to become queen and alter the course of history. Born under a scandalous spotlight, she faced countless obstacles, yet she rose to power in a realm shaped by ambition, treachery and war. Her story is full of daring moves, secret marriages and high-stakes drama. And it's not just another royal tale, hers helped bring these brutal wars to a close. So I think you've heard it all about the Wars of the Roses. Well, wait until you see how one woman stole the stage. What happens next will leave you wanting more. So let's look into the incredible life of Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth's birth alone sparked gossip. Her mother was Jacquetta of Luxembourg, a noblewoman from an old distinguished family. Jacquetta was first married at 17 to John of Lancaster, the Duke of Bedford and uncle to King Henry VI. When he died 2 years later, she was a 19-year-old widow with a comfortable fortune. The king summoned her to England, and the man chosen to escort her was Sir Richard Woodville, former chamberlain to her late husband. On that journey, Jacquetta and Richard fell in love. The problem was status. She was the Duchess of Bedford, regarded at court as the king's aunt by marriage. He was only a knight from a gentry family, and Jacquetta was also not supported to marry without royal permission, but none of that stopped them. Sometime before March 1437, they secretly wed. When the news came out, it caused a scandal. They were fined £1,000, though it was cancelled later that year. Not long afterwards, they had their first child, a girl named Elizabeth. She was born when the couple's marriage became public knowledge, though the exact dates are fuzzy. And by then, Henry VI had been king since he was an infant, and his court had gone years without a strong female presence. But that changed when he married Margaret of Anjou in 1445. Jacquetta rose in favour, and Richard Woodville advanced as well. The family prospered, but England was growing restless. In 1453, Henry VI fell into a trance-like stupor for 18 months. Unable to rule or even recognise his newborn son, he left a power vacuum. Margaret of Anjou tried to act as regent, but the idea of a woman ruling alone was unthinkable. Power instead shifted to Richard, Duke of York, a man with a strong claim to the throne. But tensions later rose between York's faction and the Lancastrians, who remained loyal to Henry. During this turmoil, Elizabeth Woodville grew up. We know little about her childhood. She likely learned to read, write, play music, dance and do needlework. But as she grew older, she was sometimes said to have served Margaret of Anjou as a lady-in-waiting through the records. After becoming a widow, Elizabeth Woodville sued for the jointure that her late husband, Sir John Grey, had left her, demonstrating her determination to secure her and her son's rights and property. Elizabeth's relationship with Edward IV not only solidified Yorkist power, but also shifted the dynamics of court politics, as many nobles were outraged by the marriage to a commoner, causing tension within the noble factions. The witchcraft accusations against Elizabeth and her family led to an increased scrutiny and animosity toward the Woodvilles, creating further divisions in court and contributing to eventual downfall of Edward IV's reign and the Woodville family's influence. At some point in her teens, she married her first husband, Sir John Grey, and they had two sons, Thomas and Richard. But by the Battle of St Albans in 1461, Elizabeth was widowed. John Grey fought for Lancaster and died in combat, leaving her with two small boys. Elizabeth fought for her rights, suing for the jointure John had left her, and it was our first glimpse of her determination. In the same year, Henry VI was deposed for the first time, but not by the Duke of York himself, York's heir, Edward, Earl of March, who took the crown as Edward IV, and it was the start of Yorkist rule. We don't know precisely when Elizabeth met Edward IV. Some accounts say they crossed paths at court events. Others claim she lay in wait under an oak tree in Whittlebury Forest. along with her 2 young sons, to plead for her lands. One thing is consistent: Edward was smitten. He was handsome, over 6 feet tall, and known for his many flings, but Elizabeth refused to become just another mistress. She would only be with him if they were married. According to a famous story, they wed secretly on May 1st, 1464, with only a priest, Jacquetta, and a few others as witnesses. It might have happened later that year. The exact dates aren't precise because Edward kept the marriage hidden. He finally admitted to it months afterwards when his council pushed him to marry a French princess. Elizabeth Woodville was no power royal. She was a widow with 2 sons, and this outraged many nobles. Edward's most powerful ally, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, felt betrayed. He'd hoped Edward would secure an international alliance through marriage and not marry a commoner. Yet as soon as Edward revealed the union, he elevated Elizabeth's large family. She had many siblings, and they all made grand matches, and that's how the Woodvilles became woven into Yorkish power circles. It ruffled feathers at court, where people whispered that these commoners were grabbing too much influence. In May 1465, Elizabeth was officially crowned at Westminster Abbey, draped in white cloth of gold, her hair loose in the traditional style, and soon in February 1466 she gave birth to her first royal child, Elizabeth. This was the first of 10 children she would have with Edward, 9 of whom lived past infancy. Hey everyone, John here. Enjoying the journey so far? Well, don't forget to like this video, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Want even more exclusive perks and behind the scenes content? Well then join as a member or snag our 7-day free trial on Patreon. Your support keeps History Roadshow rolling. Now, let's get back to the story. Despite her coronation, Elizabeth faced stiff opposition. Warwick was furious about his waning influence. In his quest to undermine the Woodville family, he accused Jacquetta and, by extension, Elizabeth of witchcraft. He claimed the only way Edward IV could have chosen a bride so far below his station was if they used magic. The evidence was laughable, some crude figurines supposedly left lying around, but accusations of sorcery were deadly back then. The charges were dismissed in January 1470 and considered nonsense. Later, these old claims resurfaced under Richard III, but were again dropped due to lack of proof. Warwick then conspired with Edward's younger brother, George, the Duke of Clarence. Edward removed George from his post as Chancellor, which set Warwick off. He turned to Margaret of Anjou, promising to restore Henry VI if she helped him overthrow Edward, and they forced Edward to flee to Flanders in 1470. Pregnant and alone, Elizabeth took her children into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. She feared Lancastrian revenge, and while hidden inside the abbey's walls she gave birth to her first son, named Edward, after his father, who was away trying to muster support abroad. Henry VI regained the throne for a short time, but his fragile rule hadn't changed. He was still prone to mental breakdowns. Meanwhile, Edward IV found assistance from his brother-in-law, the Duke of Burgundy. Armed with men and ships, Edward returned to England in 1471, wary of Henry's troubled reign. Londoners reopened their gates to him, and Edward reclaimed his crown. Henry VI was sent to the Tower of London and soon died under suspicious circumstances, likely murder rather than natural causes. Elizabeth was reinstated as queen, although she mourned the loss of her father and brother, who had been executed while she was in hiding. At the same time, Warwick died in battle, and the last major Lancastrian threat was wiped out at Tewkesbury. Margaret of Anjou's only son also perished. The Wars of the Roses quietened down, at least for a while. Meanwhile, back at court, visitors described Elizabeth as pious, gracious and beautiful. She went on pilgrimages and supported religious foundations, including Queen's College in Cambridge. Life seemed stable, but misfortune crept back again in 1483 when Edward IV fell ill. Edward IV died on April 9, 1483 at the age of 40. His son, now Edward V, was only 12. Edward IV had named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as protector. The Woodvilles didn't trust Richard. They tried to control the new king's movements. Some say they even delayed telling Richard that Edward IV was dead. Richard found out anyway, and he intercepted young Edward V's party, arrested Elizabeth's brother Anthony Woodville and her son Richard Grey, and soon had them executed without trial. Terrified, Elizabeth fled to Westminster Abbey again with her daughters and her youngest son, Richard of Shrewsbury. But Richard of Gloucester convinced her to release that son too, claiming he needed to join his brother at the Tower of London for his coronation. The coronation that never happened. Both princes vanished inside the tower, and not long after, Richard declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth had been invalid, citing a supposed pre-contract with a dead woman named Eleanor Butler. With that, Richard crowned himself Richard III, labelling Edward's children as illegitimate. Elizabeth was stripped of her titles and lands and called Dame Elizabeth Grey, and worse yet, there was no sign of her two sons. They were likely murdered in the tower. One account says Elizabeth fell to the floor screaming when she heard, and she blamed herself for handing over her second son. Elizabeth refused to give up. She teamed up with the Duke of Buckingham, who had turned against Richard III. Together, they sought help with Margaret Beaufort, the Countess of Richmond. Margaret wanted her son, Henry Tudor, back from exile, and initially Margaret only hoped to restore Henry's lands, but soon it became clear he could seize the crown himself thanks to his distant royal bloodline. Elizabeth made a bold offer. If Henry invaded and claimed the throne, he could marry her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. The girl had a stronger legal claim than Henry, at least on paper, but a female claimant alone was not considered ideal, and by merging claims, Henry's case for the throne would be more complex to deny. In 1484, Richard III publicly promised to protect Elizabeth's daughters if she left sanctuary. She complied, but quietly continued gathering support for Henry. When Richard's wife, Anne Neville, died in early 1485, rumours spread that he might marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. That was just too much for Henry to ignore, and he landed in England in August 1485. Henry Tudor and Richard III clashed at Bosworth Field on August the 22nd, 1485, and it was brutal. Henry's stepfather, Lord Stanley, arrived to help at a decisive moment. Richard III was killed in battle, and Henry was proclaimed Henry VII of England. He soon declared that Edward IV's children were legitimate after all, and it allowed him to marry Elizabeth of York, uniting both their claims. That was a relief for Elizabeth Woodville, who was restored to her privileges as Dowager Queen. Yet the court was crowded now. Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, had a powerful voice. Queen Elizabeth of York was Henry's new wife, so she took many properties once held by her mother. Some say Henry did it because he mistrusted his mother-in-law, but it was more likely just how royal estates were passed on to a reigning queen. Elizabeth Woodville was around 50 years old and considered elderly by that point, and then she decided to retire. On February the 12th, 1487, Elizabeth left court for Bermondsey Abbey. She received a £400 annual pension, which wasn't a grim exile. She visited court often, attending her grandchildren's christenings, and Henry VII even considered marrying her to James III of Scotland to secure a peace alliance, but the king died in 1488. Elizabeth lived comfortably, though we don't know if she chose quiet seclusion but was gently encouraged to step aside by the new regime. Elizabeth Woodville passed away on June the 8th, 1492. In her will, she asked for a simple funeral, which was carried out. She was buried beside Edward IV in St George's Chapel, Windsor. Over the years, people argued about her character. Some said she was a cunning upstart who used beauty and witchcraft to rise above her station. Others saw her as a savvy political mind who protected her children at all costs. In truth, she wasn't so different from other medieval nobles, taking every chance to secure her family's fortune. The difference was that she came from a background many in the upper ranks saw as too low for a queen. She never recorded her true thoughts on losing her two young sons in the Tower, but through heartbreak and chaos, she still shaped a new royal line. Her daughter, Elizabeth of York, and Henry VII founded the Tudor dynasty, bridging the houses of York and Lancaster and finally ending the Cousins' War. Elizabeth Woodville may have been born a knight's daughter, but she died a queen, a key figure in ending one of England's bloodiest struggles.